"Get this pauper away from the family table," my daughter-in-law said. And a few seconds later a security guard placed his hand politely in front of me as if I had wandered into the wrong place. I remember staring at him for a moment because at 68 years old, after raising a son, burying a husband, paying bills for decades, and spending a lifetime building a family, I never imagined I would be asked to leave my own family's dinner. I smiled at the guard because I knew he was just doing his job. Then I looked past him and searched for my son. Daniel sat at the long dining table beneath the warm amber lights of the restaurant, staring down at his plate as though the mashed potatoes in front of him had suddenly become fascinating. He didn't look at me. Not even once. I'm Margaret Hayes, and until that evening I thought humiliation was something that happened to other people. I thought family protected you from that kind of pain. I was wrong. The restaurant was one of those upscale places downtown where the menus didn't list prices, and the waiters moved quietly across the floor like they were floating. Vanessa had organized the family dinner because Emily had just received honors at school. 16 years old. Smart, kind, beautiful Emily. I had been excited all week. I even bought her a silver bracelet with a tiny heart charm because when she was 7 years old, she once told me that hearts reminded her of little pieces of love you could carry with you. I had wrapped it carefully in pale blue paper and tied a white ribbon around it myself at my kitchen table. The gift bag was still hanging from my wrist. Suddenly I felt embarrassed by it. Vanessa slowly folded her napkin onto her lap and crossed one leg over the other. She looked beautiful, perfectly put together as always. Her blonde hair rested neatly on her shoulders, and she wore a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. People loved Vanessa. They always did. She knew how to smile at exactly the right moment. She knew exactly how long to hold eye contact. She knew how to sound warm without actually being warm. "I'm sorry," the security guard said quietly. "Ma'am, I was asked to escort you outside." Around us I felt eyes lifting from tables. Not staring exactly, just looking long enough to understand something uncomfortable was happening. I looked at Daniel again. My son shifted slightly in his chair and reached for his water glass. That was all. No words. No objections. Nothing. Funny how silence can hurt more than shouting sometimes. I adjusted the strap of my purse on my shoulder and nodded gently at the guard. "Of course," I said. I could hear Vanessa laughing softly behind me as someone changed the subject at the table. The conversation resumed. Glasses clinked. Silverware touched plates. Life moved on very quickly. Outside, cold evening air brushed against my face as I stepped onto the sidewalk. The city lights reflected off parked cars along the street. I stood there holding Emily's gift bag in one hand and my purse in the other. For a few seconds I simply stared through the restaurant windows. I could see everyone sitting together inside. Smiling. Talking. Eating. Like I had never been there at all. And that was when I remembered something strange that happened 3 months earlier. I stood there for another few seconds before walking toward my car. I could still see the restaurant through the glass windows behind me. Daniel was leaning slightly toward Vanessa now. Emily sat quietly beside them. I could not see her face clearly from where I stood, but something about her posture looked different. Smaller somehow. I tightened my hand around the little blue gift bag and kept walking. The parking garage sat about 50 yards from the restaurant entrance. My low heels clicked softly against the concrete as I made my way toward my old silver Honda Accord. Harold used to joke that I kept that car cleaner than I kept the house. I smiled at the memory before opening the driver's door. Then the smile disappeared. The inside of the car felt too quiet. I sat there for a moment without starting the engine. The gift bag rested on the passenger seat beside me. The white ribbon had slipped slightly to one side. I fixed it carefully. I do not know why. I think sometimes people hold on to little things when bigger things begin falling apart. My hands rested on the steering wheel, but I did not turn the key. Instead, I stared straight ahead at the dim concrete wall in front of me. And then I remembered something from 3 months earlier. Daniel had invited me over for Sunday lunch at his house. Vanessa had made grilled chicken and salad. Emily had spent most of the afternoon upstairs studying for exams. Everything had looked normal. Everything had sounded normal too. But looking back now, there had been something strange sitting underneath it all. I remembered standing at the kitchen sink helping Vanessa put dishes away. She had smiled at me while drying a wine glass. You know, Margaret, she had said casually, Daniel and I have been talking about simplifying things. I remember glancing over at her. Simplifying? I asked. She nodded and kept drying the glass. People hold on to things for too long sometimes. Big houses, old properties, family assets. It becomes stressful after a while. At the time I thought she was making conversation. I remember laughing softly. Your father-in-law loved this house, I told her. Harold used to say walls keep memories alive. Vanessa smiled without looking at me. Memories are wonderful, she said. But they do not pay taxes. I had not thought much about it then. I should have. Looking back now, I realized Daniel barely spoke that afternoon. Every time I asked him something, Vanessa answered first. I asked about his work. Vanessa answered. I asked about Emily's school plans. Vanessa answered. I asked whether they wanted to come over for Easter dinner the next month. Vanessa smiled and said they already had plans. Daniel had simply nodded. Funny how memory works. Sometimes it waits quietly in the corner until pain shines a light on it. Then suddenly every detail becomes clear. I leaned back in my seat and looked at the dashboard clock glowing softly in the dark. 9:14. I looked down at my phone. No missed calls. No text messages. Nothing from Daniel. Nothing from anyone. The silence felt familiar suddenly. Not new. Familiar. Like maybe it had been growing for a long time, and I had only just noticed it tonight. I finally started the car and drove home, but I could barely remember the streets I took to get there. The radio stayed off. The heater hummed softly through the vents while headlights from passing cars slid across the windshield and disappeared into the night. My house sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees. Harold and I bought it 34 years ago when Daniel was 7 years old. Back then the trees were small enough for him to run around. Now they stretched high above the roof like silent guards watching over old memories. I pulled into the driveway and sat there for another minute before getting out. The porch light switched on automatically as I walked toward the front door. Harold used to call it my little welcome committee. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house greeted me with silence. Real silence. Not restaurant silence with glasses clinking and people pretending not to stare. This was different. This was the kind of silence that settles into walls after years of routine suddenly disappear. I set my purse down and placed Emily's gift bag carefully on the kitchen counter. The blue wrapping paper looked too cheerful sitting there beneath the warm overhead light. I stared at it for a moment before opening the refrigerator and pouring myself a glass of water. Then I noticed something. My phone screen lit up. For 1 second my heart lifted. Daniel. I thought maybe he had finally called. Maybe he had followed me outside after all. Maybe he had said something to Vanessa once I left. Maybe he had remembered that I was still his mother. I picked up the phone quickly. It was not Daniel. It was a message from Emily. Just 6 words. Grandma, I am really sorry. I stared at the screen. Then I read it again. 6 words. That was all. But somehow those 6 words felt heavier than everything that happened inside the restaurant. Because Emily apologized. Which meant Emily knew. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table and looked at the message again. I remembered when Emily was 8 years old and terrified of thunderstorms. She used to run into my guest room whenever she spent the night at my house. Harold would make hot chocolate while I sat beside her and told her stories. Until the rain stopped. Storms always pass. I used to tell her. You just have to wait. I looked at her message and felt something strange settle into my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Something quieter. I typed back slowly. You do not have to apologize, sweetheart. 3 little dots appeared immediately on the screen. Then disappeared. Then appeared again. I waited. Finally another message arrived. Grandma. There is something I think you should know. I felt my fingers stop moving. I looked down at the words and suddenly remembered all the strange little moments over the past year. The canceled visits. The forgotten invitations. The awkward silences. One by one they seemed to rise from the dark corners of my memory like puzzle pieces sliding into place. And for the first time that night, I started wondering if being removed from that dinner had never really been the beginning at all. My thumb hovered over the screen for a few seconds before I finally typed back. What is it, sweetheart? I sat there waiting with both hands wrapped around my glass of water. The kitchen clock above the stove ticked softly against the silence around me. 10 years ago I never noticed clocks. Harold used to fill every room with sound. He hummed while reading the newspaper. He talked to baseball games on television as if the players could hear him. He whistled while watering flowers in the backyard. Funny how after someone is gone, silence starts making itself at home in places where love used to live. 3 little dots appeared on my phone again, then disappeared, then returned. I could almost picture Emily sitting somewhere with her knees pulled up against her chest, staring down at her own screen, trying to decide whether she should say something she had probably been carrying for a long time. Finally the message arrived. "Grandma, please do not tell Mom I said anything." My stomach tightened. I stared at the words. Then another message appeared. "She told everyone not to tell you about the lake house meeting." I blinked slowly. The lake house meeting. I read it again. Then once more. My fingers felt cold suddenly. I typed carefully. "What lake house meeting?" The reply did not come right away this time. I stood up and walked slowly toward the kitchen window. Outside, the porch light cast soft yellow light across the yard. Harold planted roses beneath that window 20 years ago. Even now I could still see their shadows moving slightly in the wind. My phone buzzed again. A few weeks ago Dad and Mom had dinner with Uncle Michael and some people. Mom said they were discussing family property stuff. Family property stuff. I frowned. Michael Brooks had been Harold's closest friend for more than 40 years. Michael was the kind of man who remembered birthdays and called every Christmas morning at exactly 8 o'clock. He still sent me handwritten cards every year after Harold passed away. But I had not heard anything about a dinner. I walked back to the table and sat down again. Suddenly another memory surfaced. 2 months ago Michael called while I was grocery shopping. I had missed the call because my phone stayed buried somewhere inside my purse. Later that evening I remembered seeing his voicemail notification. I remembered pressing play while washing dishes. "Margaret, give me a call when you get a chance," he had said. "Nothing urgent. I just wanted to ask you something." That was it. I had forgotten to call him back. Life does that sometimes. Small things slip through unnoticed. Then weeks pass. Then months. I looked down at Emily's messages again. Family property. Lake house meeting. Do not tell Mom. Suddenly the strange little pieces from the past year did not feel random anymore. They felt connected. Like stepping outside during the first snowfall and realizing all the footprints in the yard had been leading somewhere all along. I stared at the dark window above the sink and saw my own reflection looking back at me. Then I quietly whispered something to myself that I had not said all evening. What exactly have they been doing? Sleep never really came that night. I turned off the kitchen light sometime after midnight and went upstairs, but my mind kept moving long after the house settled into silence. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above me. Every now and then headlights from passing cars moved across the walls and disappeared. Harold used to fall asleep within 5 minutes of his head touching the pillow. I used to tease him about it. He always smiled and said, "Margaret, if your conscience is clear, sleep comes easy." Around 6:30 the next morning I finally gave up trying. I made coffee and stood beside the kitchen window watching sunlight creep across the backyard. The roses looked pale under the early morning light. My phone sat on the counter beside me. I looked at Michael's name in my contacts for almost a full minute before pressing call. It rang twice. "Margaret." His voice sounded surprised. "Everything all right?" I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug. "I am not sure," I said quietly. There was a small pause. Then Michael spoke again, but his voice sounded different now. More careful. "Margaret, is something wrong?" I stared out at the backyard. Emily mentioned something about a dinner meeting a few weeks ago. Silence. Not long. Maybe 2 seconds. But long enough. "Michael?" I asked softly. I heard him exhale slowly on the other end. "Margaret," he finally said. "I think maybe we should talk in person." My stomach tightened again. "Why?" Another pause. "Because I do not think this is a conversation for the phone." 45 minutes later I pulled into the parking lot of a small diner about 10 miles from my house. Michael was already there sitting in a booth near the windows. He wore his usual navy jacket and reading glasses. Harold always used to joke that Michael looked like a retired college professor, even when he was 30 years old. Normally he smiled the second he saw me. This time he did not. I sat down across from him and set my purse beside me. Neither of us spoke right away. A waitress poured coffee into our cups and walked away. Michael kept turning his wedding ring around his finger. I noticed that immediately because he only did that when he felt nervous. I had seen him do it once at Harold's funeral. "Michael," I said quietly, "what is going on?" He looked down at the coffee sitting in front of him. Then he looked back at me. "Margaret, I thought you knew." I felt something inside me go. Still. Not racing. Not panicking. Just still. Knew what? He leaned back slightly and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Sadness mixed with confusion. "Daniel and Vanessa said you had already agreed." I stared at him. Agreed to what? Michael blinked once. Then he slowly said words that made the room suddenly feel smaller around me. "To selling the lake house property Harold left behind." For a moment I thought I had heard him wrong. The sounds around me seemed to drift farther away. The soft clinking of coffee cups. The quiet conversations from other tables. The waitress laughing near the register. Everything suddenly felt distant, like I had been pushed underwater. I stared at Michael without saying anything. Then I smiled slightly because sometimes when life says something impossible, your mind reaches for comfort before reality catches up. "Michael," I said quietly, "there must be some mistake." He did not smile back. He just looked at me. "Harold sold that lake house years ago." Michael slowly shook his head. "No, Margaret." My fingers tightened around the coffee cup. "No." He leaned forward slightly. "Harold never sold it." I blinked. Once. Then again. I felt the expression leave my face completely. Harold bought that property almost 20 years ago. It sat beside Lake Morrison about 2 hours north of town. Just a small place with a wooden dock and pine trees surrounding it. Nothing extravagant. Harold always called it his retirement dream. During summers we used to drive there on weekends with Daniel when he was younger. Daniel learned how to fish off that dock. I could still picture his little sneakers running across the grass carrying a tackle box almost bigger than he was. But after Harold became sick, we stopped visiting as often. After he passed away, I could not bring myself to go there at all. Too many memories lived in that place. Too much of him. I looked at Michael again. "Harold told me he sold it," I said softly. Michael frowned immediately. "Sold it?" He slowly reached into the leather folder sitting beside him and opened it. Then he pulled out several sheets of paper. "Margaret, I only know this because Harold asked me to help organize some documents years ago." He slid the papers toward me. I stared down at them. Property records. Legal papers. Harold's name. My name. I saw the familiar address near Lake Morrison printed clearly across the page. My eyes moved lower. Then stopped. Harold Hayes and Margaret Hayes, co-owners. I felt my heartbeat begin moving harder against my chest. Not fast. Just heavier. "That cannot be right," I whispered. Michael looked at me carefully. "Margaret, 3 weeks ago Daniel and Vanessa asked me to meet them." He paused for a moment. "They told me you wanted to sell the property because maintaining it had become too difficult." I stared at him. He continued quietly. "Vanessa said you wanted to simplify things and move forward." Simplify things. Suddenly I heard her voice again from that Sunday afternoon in her kitchen. "Memories are wonderful, but they do not pay taxes." I looked down at the papers again. My eyes kept moving over the words even though I had stopped reading. Then another thought slowly entered my mind. I looked up at Michael. "If I still own it?" My voice stopped. Michael said nothing. He did not need to, because suddenly another question had taken its place. If I still owned the property, then why had Daniel and Vanessa been acting like they already did? I sat there looking down at the papers while my coffee slowly grew cold beside me. Strange thing about betrayal. People imagine it arrives like thunder. Loud. Sudden. Impossible to ignore. But sometimes it does not. Sometimes it arrives quietly and sits beside you for months before you finally recognize it. Suddenly I was not seeing documents anymore. I was seeing moments. Little moments. Tiny things I had ignored because love has a way of explaining things for people we trust. Last Thanksgiving, Daniel insisted on hosting dinner at his house instead of coming to mine. I remembered standing in his kitchen while Vanessa handed me a glass of iced tea. Daniel had been sitting at the dining table with his laptop open. I remember asking him what he was working on. Before he could answer, Vanessa smiled and said, "Just boring paperwork." Daniel had looked up for a second. Then he closed the laptop almost immediately. At the time I thought nothing of it. I remembered Christmas too. Daniel had asked strange questions while we sat beside the fireplace. "Mom, have you ever thought about downsizing?" he asked casually. "This house probably feels big with just you here." I remember laughing softly. Not really. I had looked around at the decorations hanging from the staircase. Besides, every room has memories. Daniel nodded but did not say much after that. Vanessa had smiled into her wine glass. Back then I thought they were worried about me getting older. I thought maybe they cared. Sitting across from Michael now, another memory surfaced. 2 months ago, Daniel called unexpectedly one afternoon. We talked for nearly 20 minutes. Mostly small things. The weather. Emily's school. Baseball season starting. Then just before hanging up, he asked, "Mom, where do you keep Dad's old paperwork?" I remember smiling because I thought he was feeling sentimental. "Probably in the upstairs study closet," I told him. "Why?" "No reason," he said quickly. "I was just curious." No reason. Funny how certain words sound different once truth catches up with them. I looked up at Michael slowly. "Do you think Daniel knows?" I asked quietly. Michael looked down for a moment. "Margaret," he began carefully. Then he sighed. "I do not know." I nodded slightly, but deep down I think I already knew the answer before I asked. Daniel was not a little boy anymore. He was 41 years old. A husband. A father. A man who sat silently while I was escorted away from a family dinner. Silence has meaning too. I looked back down at the papers and carefully stacked them together. Then I slid them back toward Michael. "Can I borrow these?" I asked. He blinked once. "Of course." I smiled gently and placed the folder into my purse. Michael looked at me carefully then. "Margaret, what are you going to do?" I sat quietly for a moment. Outside the diner window I watched people walking across the parking lot carrying coffee cups and grocery bags, living ordinary mornings without realizing how quickly lives can change. Then I looked back at him and smiled softly. "Nothing," I said. And for the first time since leaving that restaurant, I saw someone look worried for a reason that had nothing to do with me. The drive home felt different that morning. The streets were the same. The traffic lights changed at the same intersections. People stood outside coffee shops holding paper cups and checking their phones. Everything looked ordinary. But ordinary things stop feeling ordinary once you realize you have been standing inside a lie. I got home just after 11 and carried Michael's folder inside with me. The house felt exactly the same as it had the day before. The same family pictures lined the hallway. The same grandfather clock sat near the staircase. The same pale yellow curtains moved gently beside the kitchen windows. Yet somehow even the walls felt like they knew something I did not. I set the folder down on the dining room table and stared at it for a moment. Then I walked upstairs. Harold's study had remained almost untouched since he passed away 3 years earlier. I dusted it every week, but I never changed anything. His reading chair still sat beside the window. His framed navy photograph still rested on the bookshelf. Even his old leather desk organizer remained exactly where he left it. I opened the closet door slowly. Stacks of boxes sat neatly against the back wall. Holiday decorations. Tax records. Old photo albums. I knelt down and pulled out a gray storage box marked personal documents. Dust lifted softly into the sunlight. I sat cross-legged on the carpet and opened it carefully. Inside were folders arranged in Harold's familiar handwriting. Insurance. Investments. Property. Trust documents. My eyes stopped moving. Trust documents. I frowned slightly because I did not remember Harold ever discussing a trust. I pulled the folder out slowly and carried it downstairs. For the next 20 minutes I sat at the dining room table reading page after page. Then I read them again. My eyes moved slower the second time because suddenly I was no longer searching. I was understanding. Harold had created a family trust nearly 8 years earlier. I stared at the pages in silence. Lake Morrison property held under trust ownership. Family residence held under trust ownership. Primary beneficiary, Margaret Hayes. Successor beneficiaries under specific conditions. I blinked and continued reading. My heart was not racing anymore. Strangely, it had become very calm. Then I reached a section highlighted in yellow. I leaned closer. The trust stated that no sale or transfer of property could happen without my written approval, while I remained living and mentally competent. I read the sentence twice, then 3 times. Outside, a bird landed briefly on the backyard fence. Somewhere upstairs, the air conditioner clicked on. Everything around me kept moving normally while I sat perfectly still. Vanessa had been talking about property. Daniel had been asking about paperwork. Michael had been told I already agreed. But none of it mattered. None of it could happen without me. I slowly leaned back in my chair and looked across the room toward Harold's photograph sitting on the fireplace mantel. His smile looked exactly the same as it always had. Quiet, gentle, certain. Suddenly I remembered something he once told me years ago, while we sat on the dock at Lake Morrison watching the sunset. "Margaret," he had said, "if something ever happens to me, I just want to know you will always be safe." At the time I laughed and told him he worried too much. Sitting there now, I realized Harold had not been worrying at all. He had been planning. 3 days passed before Daniel finally called me. 3 days. I noticed that because people count strange things after they get hurt. They count days, hours, missed calls. I was standing in the grocery store comparing 2 jars of pasta sauce when my phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I looked at it for a moment before answering. "Hi, Mom." His voice sounded normal. Too normal. Like we were continuing a conversation that had only paused yesterday. "Hi, sweetheart," I said quietly. "How are you?" There was a small pause. "Good." Then another pause. "Vanessa and I were wondering if you wanted to come over Friday night." I picked up a jar from the shelf and looked at the label even though I was not reading it. "Friday." "Yes," he said quickly. "Just family dinner. Emily keeps asking about you." I smiled slightly to myself. "Emily? Of course. That sounds nice," I said. Friday evening arrived with soft spring rain tapping against my windshield as I pulled into Daniel's driveway. The house looked warm from outside. Light spilled through the windows. I sat in the car for a few seconds before stepping out. This time I carried no gift bags. No ribbon. No expectations. Vanessa opened the door wearing a bright smile. "Margaret," she said warmly, leaning forward to hug me. "We have missed you." Funny how people become generous with kindness when they think they are getting close to something they want. I smiled back gently. "That is sweet of you." Dinner looked beautiful. Candles flickered softly in the center of the table. Emily smiled the second she saw me and wrapped her arms around me. Daniel looked relieved. Vanessa moved around the room filling glasses and laughing easily. Anyone walking into that house would have thought they were looking at a perfect family. Halfway through dinner, Vanessa finally set down her fork and smiled toward me. "Margaret," she said carefully, "Daniel and I have been thinking about family planning lately." "Family planning?" I almost smiled. Daniel shifted slightly beside her. Vanessa continued. "We were talking about future investments and simplifying responsibilities." There was that word again. Simplifying. I took a sip of water and nodded politely. "That sounds important." Vanessa leaned forward. "We were also thinking about the lake property." Silence settled across the table for one small moment. Daniel looked at his plate. Emily looked down too. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate. Then I looked directly at Vanessa. "Really?" I asked softly. Her smile widened slightly. "We thought maybe now would be the perfect time." Perfect time. I looked around the table slowly. Then I looked back at Daniel. "Funny," I said gently. "A few days ago I was not good enough to sit at a family table." Nobody moved. Vanessa's smile disappeared first. Then Daniel slowly looked up at me. I reached into my purse and placed Harold's trust documents quietly on the table between us. And now suddenly everyone wants to discuss family property.